I'm anticipating a recession deeper than anything we've seen in the last generation.
On this edition of Expert Answers, we're taking stock of the coronavirus's impact on the private sector and asking what has the pandemic meant for companies and jobs, and what role will the private sector play during the recovery. The IFC, that's the part of the World Bank Group that's charged with private sector development, has been central to our COVID-19 response, and I recently had the chance to sit down with its Chief Operating Officer, Stephanie von Friedeburg, to learn more. Well, let's jump right into it, Stephanie. Obviously, over the past few weeks, much of the focus has been on the health dimension of the pandemic. But the coronavirus is also having this severe economic effect across the globe. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the impact is that you're seeing, especially when it comes to the developing world?
I don't want to make light of the humanitarian crisis. I know it's unprecedented in our time, but the global economy is truly suffering. We're estimating that the recession will be substantially deeper and longer than what followed the 2008 crisis, and especially for emerging markets. It's both a supply and a demand shock, and it's affecting the real sector in ways we didn't see it during the 2008 crisis. If you look at production, employment, trade, all are down. And I worry greatly for emerging markets. We have already seen somewhere in the range of $100 billion leave emerging markets since the beginning of January. And we're estimating that foreign direct investment will be down 40% in both 2020 and 2021 from its base in 2019. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm anticipating a recession deeper than anything we've seen in the last generation. And it's going to affect the poor and the most fragile the worst. And I'm quite worried. And if you put that in perspective of what we're seeing in both Europe and the US in terms of the ability to create liquidity in the economy and to provide support, in our countries of operation, the fiscal space just is not there. And the only way that we will prevent a catastrophe as a result of COVID economically is to rely on the private sector.
Many of the hotspots, at least to me, to the somewhat untrained eye here, they seem to be in advanced economies. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you think the poorest economies are going to be hit so hard?
So let's start with the health aspect. In our countries of operation, we have lower living standards and we have poor health infrastructure. In 34 African countries, less than $200 per capita per annum is spent on health. If you look at just the medical infrastructure in and of itself, and then you add to that poor nutrition, lack of sanitation and clean water, you exacerbate the problem. Probably even more important is the fact that much of these economies are informal. And that informality actually is done in a very social way in very congested and overcrowded cities. The ability for our countries to be able to enact social distancing, tracking is virtually impossible. And then if you add on top of that the idea of lockdowns and stay at home, it's extremely difficult to do when your economy is informal and when you're driving growth in that direction. So that's kind of the health picture. And then I turn and I look at the economic picture. So the majority of the economies in our countries are not nearly as diversified as they are in the United States or in Europe. Many of them are dependent on global supply chains, and as we have already seen, these global supply chains have been substantively disrupted. And as I follow the press, I listen to things should be nearshored, things should be onshored, and I wonder, how does a country ever survive if its reliance on global supply chains is broken? Then we have other countries that are heavily dependent on commodities. And we've seen what's happened to the price of oil. It's crashed. We have mines shuttered all over the world. And when I look at the rate at which we're anticipating the US economy and the European economy to come back, the prices of commodities are not going to go up anytime in the near future. And then we have countries that are dependent on tourism and travel. If you're the Maldives and you have climate change and COVID, does your tourism sector ever recover? And finally, I would look at remittances. In some of our countries, remittances represent as much as 40% of GDP. And we're anticipating for the lower middle income countries a decline of more than 20% in remittances. How will the poorest and the most vulnerable survive if that path to income is disrupted?
And, one of the things, Stephanie, that I think makes this crisis so unique is the widespread shutdown of just large swaths of the economy. Can you talk me through some of the challenges that these lockdowns have posed for the private sector, both for the companies in the private sector and for the workers that staff those companies?
Paul, I would start by saying it doesn't matter whether you're in a developed country or a developing country. Locking down an economy creates insolvency. And what we're going to see is a rise in unemployment and a loss of jobs, liquidity issues at the firm level, and the longer the lockdown lasts, the more probability of insolvency. If we go back to this notion of an informal economy, 1.6 billion people make their livelihood in the informal economy. We know that that is going to be drastically hit as a result of the COVID crisis. And how will those people be able to put food on the table and keep a roof over their heads for their family? Very, very disconcerting. We're actually anticipating for the first time in 25 years that Africa will experience a recession.
In a moment, I want to shift this conversation, towards the response and the work that the International Finance Corporation is doing. Can you talk me through, the basics and the need-to-knows of the IFC's response and how it will, help address some of the challenges that you've been telling us about over this program so far?
Our intention is to try to the extent possible to help prevent the destruction of markets and the destruction of companies. We're trying to ensure to the extent possible that we keep as many jobs as we can in emerging markets. And again, if we go back to what we know, if liquidity leads to insolvency and we lose existing companies, we know that the path to restructuring and recovery is going to be all that much more difficult. So what we first decided to do was to design a fast-track $8 billion package to make available to our existing clients. These are real sector clients and financial institutions across the globe. At $6 billion of that $8 billion, we will make available to financial institutions, large institutions in all of our countries of operation, to do primarily two things. First, to ensure that trade continues to flow. And second, to help them reach out to the microfinance and the MSMEs in their countries of operation. Again, the bottom of the pyramid, the smaller companies, the informal sector, where we want to try to the extent possible to preserve jobs. The remaining $2 billion of our phase one package is designed for the real sector. We've never tried it before in any other crisis, but in looking at this crisis and understanding that it was not necessarily just impacting the financial sector, but the real sector, we believed that we needed to find a way to help our existing clients who were in sectors like tourism, retail, transport, power. And so we set aside $2 billion to provide liquidity to those existing clients. In a way, it's a bit of an experiment, but a very important one.
Stephanie, thank you so much for being here and for taking the time this morning.
It was great. Thank you very much. Good program.
A big thanks to Stephanie von Friedeburg for taking some time out of her schedule to share thoughts. If you want to learn more about the World Bank Group's response to the COVID-19 crisis, head on over to worldbank.org/coronavirus. And in the meantime, you can send us your feedback, your questions, your ideas. Email us at expertanswers@worldbank.org. Until next time, goodbye.